As the room grows quiet, let your thoughts sail away. Before you drift any deeper, if this quiet helps you feel safe tonight, you're welcome to stay with us. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and lets these nights continue. Now, rest. History often comforts us with noise, with shouting crowds, burning cities, clashing swords, and moments that feel dramatic enough to be remembered. Violence, when it is loud, gives us something simple to react to. We can point at it, we can condemn it, we can close the book and feel morally taller for having witnessed it from a safe distance. Ancient Rome rarely offered that kind of comfort. Rome preferred quiet. Its power did not scream, it whispered, it signed documents, it organized calendars, it scheduled punishments and called them procedures. And in doing so, it built one of the most durable systems of control the ancient world had ever seen. This is why Rome still unsettles us, even when centuries have softened its edges, not because it was uniquely cruel, but because it was uniquely calm about it. If brutality bursts, people notice. If brutality becomes routine, it becomes invisible. Rome understood this early. When we imagine Roman slavery, we often picture chains, whips, and suffering laid bare. And while those things certainly existed, they were not the foundation of the system. They were merely tools. The real foundation was something far more subtle, far more dangerous, and far more familiar to modern minds. It was administration. Rome did not ask whether slavery was moral. It asked whether it was efficient, whether it was stable, whether it looked respectable enough to survive public scrutiny. And once those questions were answered, the rest followed naturally, quietly, and with remarkable confidence. This is where tonight's story begins. Not with the question of what Roman slave owners did, but with the far more revealing question of what they were not allowed to do. On the surface, it sounds almost reassuring, almost humane. Surely a society that asks what it must restrain is a society moving toward compassion. But history rarely rewards optimism. When you examine these limits closely, they reveal not a growing conscience, but a carefully maintained boundary, a line drawn not to protect the powerless, but to preserve the system itself. A reminder that even absolute power sometimes learns to place a hand gently on its own wrist, not out of mercy, but out of self-preservation. In Rome, cruelty was not uncontrolled. It was curated. A master could own another human being entirely, yet still be told occasionally to lower his voice, to avoid unnecessary spectacle, to keep his household orderly enough that neighbors would not whisper too loudly at dinner parties. This was not kindness. This was branding. Rome cared deeply about appearances, about dignity, about the smooth functioning of daily life, and nothing disrupts daily life quite like chaos that spills into the streets. Dead workers piling up, angry crowds murmuring, systems beginning to creak under their own excess. So Rome did what Rome always did. It regulated. Not to remove violence, but to soften its edges. Not to restore humanity, but to prevent embarrassment. Not to protect the enslaved, but to ensure that the people who owned them could continue doing so without inconvenience. In this way, Roman law did something remarkable. It created the illusion of restraint without ever surrendering control. And illusions, as Rome knew well, are often more powerful than chains. Tonight, we are not here to catalog horrors. That has been done before loudly and often. Instead, we are here to listen to the quieter story, the one that hums beneath the surface, the one that asks uncomfortable questions not about monsters, but about systems that function beautifully while doing terrible things. Because Rome did not survive for centuries by accident. It survived because it learned how to make domination feel ordinary. It learned how to make suffering administrative. It learned how to turn people into assets, assets into numbers, and numbers into something that could be balanced neatly on a ledger. And once something fits neatly into a ledger, it stops feeling personal. This is why Roman slavery did not collapse under the weight of its own brutality. It adapted. It refined itself. It added footnotes. It issued guidelines. It allowed just enough hope to keep resistance manageable and just enough fear to keep obedience reliable. Hope, after all, is cheaper than force. If a slave believes freedom might one day be possible, they work longer. They obey more carefully. They wait. And waiting, Rome understood, is one of the most powerful tools of control ever invented. So when emperors eventually declared that certain actions were unacceptable, when laws emerged suggesting that perhaps killing a slave without reason was no longer ideal, this was not a moral awakening. It was a logistical one. A dead slave produces nothing. An angry city produces unrest. A scandal produces questions. And Rome disliked questions. Better to smooth the process, better to require paperwork, better to make cruelty boring, procedural, and largely invisible. That way everyone could sleep at night. And Rome did sleep. Very well, in fact, on cushions, with servants nearby, with the comforting knowledge that everything, including human lives, was accounted for. This is the unsettling genius of Roman power. It did not rely on constant terror. It relied on normalization, on repetition, on the slow erosion of outrage until nothing felt shocking anymore. When cruelty becomes routine, it stops feeling cruel. It starts feeling necessary. And necessity, once established, is rarely questioned. So as we move forward tonight, let the noise fade. Let the familiar images of spectacle drift away. What remains is something quieter, colder, and far more instructive. A civilization that mastered the art of control, not by exploding outward, but by settling inward. A system that never needed to raise its voice. And that, perhaps, is what makes it hardest to forget. With that quiet system in place, the central question becomes clearer and also more disturbing. What exactly did Rome decide was too much? Where did it draw its lines? And more importantly, why those lines and not others? At first glance, the question seems almost generous. What could Roman slave owners not do? It sounds like the beginning of progress, the first tremor of restraint in a world built on ownership. But history rarely moves in straight lines, and Rome was especially fond of circles. The limits placed on masters did not emerge because enslaved people were suddenly seen as human. They emerged because Rome needed order. It needed predictability. It needed a workforce that survived long enough to remain useful. And it needed a public image stable enough to prevent unrest. Every restriction we will explore flows from that logic. Owners were not told to stop hurting slaves. They were told not to hurt them in ways that caused problems, not to kill them impulsively, not to punish them publicly without justification, not to create spectacles that disturbed neighbors or invited scrutiny. The concern was never pain. It was disruption. Rome's laws did not aim to eliminate suffering. They aimed to manage it, to channel it, to keep it within boundaries that protected the interests of those at the top. Even the rare paths toward freedom were not gifts of compassion. They were incentives, rewards designed to encourage obedience, patience, and loyalty. Freedom was dangled like a distant light, not to guide people out, but to keep them walking forward inside the maze. And so, as we move into the core of this story, remember this. We are not examining kindness. We are examining control, refined to the point where it almost resembles mercy. Almost. The rules Rome imposed were never meant to balance power. They were meant to preserve it. And once we understand that, the question shifts again. Not what Rome allowed or forbade, but how a civilization could maintain such a system for centuries while convincing itself that it was reasonable. That is the journey ahead, and it begins quietly with the law. When humanity was reclassified. How Roman law turned people into property. In ancient Rome, the most important thing to understand about slavery is not how loud it was, but how quiet it felt. Slavery did not arrive with dramatic announcements or thunderous declarations. It settled into daily life the way dust settles on stone. Slowly, naturally, almost invisibly. By the time anyone thought to question it, it already felt permanent, like gravity or weather, or the passing of time itself. Roman law did not describe enslaved people as broken humans or failed citizens. It used a much simpler term, res, a thing, an object, something that could be owned, transferred, modified, damaged, improved, or discarded. This classification mattered more than any whip or chain, because once a human being is legally defined as a thing, everything else becomes administrative detail. Pain becomes maintenance. Control becomes management. Cruelty becomes routine. To a Roman jurist, a slave was not a person with limited rights. They were property with advanced functionality, a tool that could speak, a machine that required food instead of oil, a living instrument whose value depended entirely on usefulness. And usefulness in Rome was measured with calm efficiency, not emotional attachment. There was no concept of personal dignity attached to an enslaved body, no assumption that a slave possessed an inner life worth respecting. Roman law did not ask whether a slave had feelings, memories, or fears. Those questions were irrelevant. Objects do not require emotional consideration. Objects only require care to the extent that they remain functional. This is why Roman slavery endured so smoothly for centuries. It did not rely on constant terror. It relied on classification. Once a person was legally removed from the category of human, Every act committed against them required less justification. Harm no longer needed explanation. It only needed a reason related to efficiency. A slave could be punished not because they disobeyed, but because punishment was considered a legitimate form of correction. Just as one sharpens a blade or replaces a cracked wheel, one disciplined a slave. The language mattered. Rome did not speak of abuse, it spoke of management. There was no legal recognition of bodily autonomy. The body of a slave did not belong to the slave. It belonged to the owner in full. Every movement, every injury, every scar was legally part of someone else's property. If a slave was harmed, the law did not ask whether the person suffered. It asked whether the property had been damaged in a way that reduced its value. Honor, reputation, and identity did not apply downward. These were privileges of citizenship, not qualities of humanity. A slave had no legal honor to violate, no dignity to offend, no reputation to ruin. Roman law did not strip these things away. It simply never granted them in the first place. Names followed the same logic. A slave's name was not a marker of identity, but a label of function. Names could be changed casually, removed entirely, or replaced with nicknames based on labor or perceived usefulness. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was efficiency. A renamed object is easier to reassign. A person without a stable identity is easier to control. The absence of personal rights was not seen as harsh. It was seen as orderly. Rome valued order above empathy, and the legal system reflected that priority with remarkable clarity. Everything had a place, everyone had a role, and slaves occupied the role of things that worked. Because of this classification, later protections introduced by Roman law must be understood in context. When restrictions appeared, they did not emerge from a sudden recognition of humanity. They emerged from practical concerns. A broken tool is expensive. A dead slave produces nothing. A household that looks chaotic invites scrutiny. Roman law did not ask owners to stop thinking of slaves as objects. It simply asked them to manage those objects responsibly, not gently, responsibly, which in Roman terms meant avoiding unnecessary loss, public disturbance, or legal embarrassment. This distinction is subtle but essential. Rome never moved enslaved people into the category of human beings. It merely refined the rules governing the treatment of valuable property. This is why even the most progressive laws of the empire still rested on the same foundation. A slave was a thing that worked, and things that work must be preserved. There is a strange calm that emerges when a society fully accepts this logic. Violence becomes predictable. Suffering becomes procedural. Nothing feels personal. Even cruelty loses its emotional edge when it is folded neatly into routine. Roman households functioned like small bureaucracies. Schedules were kept, duties assigned, discipline administered. The enslaved body became part of the architecture of daily life, as expected and unremarkable as walls or doorways. You passed it without comment. This normalization is what makes Roman slavery so unsettling to modern eyes. Not the brutality itself, but the ease with which it was absorbed into ordinary existence. There were no debates about morality because the category itself had already been decided. You do not debate the rights of furniture. You decide where to place it. Once this mental shift is understood, everything else follows. The absence of rights, the lack of legal protection, the casual destruction of families. None of these were aberrations. They were logical consequences of classification. And yet Rome was not careless. It did not destroy its own assets without thought. It did not encourage chaos within households. Control, after all, works best when it appears calm. So limits were introduced, carefully, quietly, always in service of stability. But those limits never challenged the core assumption. Slaves remained objects, objects that worked, objects that could feel pain, yes, but pain was not legally meaningful. Pain did not change classification. This is the foundation upon which every later rule was built. Every reform, every restriction, every so-called protection, they were adjustments to a system, not corrections of injustice. And once you understand that, the story becomes clearer, colder, and strangely easier to follow. Rome did not fail to recognize the humanity of slaves. It deliberately chose not to. That choice allowed the empire to function smoothly for centuries. It allowed wealth to accumulate. It allowed labor to flow without resistance. It allowed cruelty to hide behind procedure. And it allowed everyone involved to sleep at night. Because when suffering is legal, orderly, and expected, it stops feeling like suffering at all. It becomes background noise. It becomes history. And so within this quiet legal framework, a strange kind of peace settled over Roman society. Not peace in the moral sense, but peace in the mechanical sense. Everything had its category. Everything had its place. And once a human being was successfully reclassified as property, the system no longer needed to explain itself. This is why Roman law appears so calm when read today. There is no anger in its language, no hatred, no urgency. It does not argue that slaves deserve their position. It simply assumes it. Assumptions, after all, are the most powerful form of authority. They do not shout. They do not persuade. They wait patiently for everyone else to accept them as reality. A slave's body existed in this space of assumption. It was present, visible, active, yet legally absent. It could work, bleed, age, and break, but none of those states carried independent meaning. Meaning only emerged when the condition of the body affected its owner. Injury mattered when it reduced productivity. Death mattered when it caused inconvenience. Even mercy, when it appeared, was framed through ownership. A master who treated slaves well was not praised for kindness toward people, but for competence in managing assets. Generosity was admired as a personal virtue, not as a moral obligation. One could be indulgent with one's possessions, but never answerable to them. This distinction shaped everything. It shaped discipline. It shaped living arrangements. It shaped the way households spoke about labor, punishment, and loss. When a slave disappeared, the language did not dwell on absence. It adjusted schedules. And because this logic was embedded so deeply, it rarely felt violent to those benefiting from it. Violence, after all, implies rupture. Roman slavery was continuous, smooth, predictable. It flowed through generations like an inheritance, passed down with land and furniture, quietly renewing itself without spectacle. The law supported this continuity not by celebrating domination, but by normalizing it, by treating ownership as a neutral fact rather than a moral choice. This neutrality is what allowed Roman society to function without constant resistance. It is difficult to rebel against something that does not announce itself as cruelty. Instead, it announces itself as order. And order is comforting. Order promises safety. Order reassures those at the top that nothing will change unexpectedly. Even those at the bottom, after enough time, learn to navigate it. They learn where the walls are, where the rules bend, where hope might exist, however faintly. But hope in this system never challenged classification. It operated inside it. Freedom, when granted, did not undo the logic of ownership. It simply marked the end of one transaction and the beginning of another social arrangement. The former slave carried the imprint of property even into legal freedom. This is why the idea of legal status matters so much. It is not an abstract concept. It is the lens through which all actions are interpreted. In Rome, legal status decided whose pain mattered, whose voice counted, and whose existence required explanation. Slaves did not lose their humanity in Rome. Humanity was irrelevant to the law. The law was concerned with function, stability, and control. Everything else was background. And once a society accepts that distinction, it can maintain almost any system indefinitely. This is the quiet lesson of Roman slavery. Not that cruelty existed, but that cruelty was made sustainable. It was wrapped in routine, filed into categories, handed down as precedent, and in doing so it became invisible enough to last. As the empire expanded, this foundation did not crack. It strengthened. Every new rule, every new restriction placed on owners rested on the same assumption. Slaves were things that worked, things that could be managed better or worse, but never questioned as things. And this is where the later limits gain their true meaning. They were not cracks in the system, they were reinforcements, adjustments that allowed the structure to survive changing circumstances without altering its core. To understand what Roman slave owners were later told they could not do, one must first accept this uncomfortable truth. Those prohibitions were never about recognizing personhood. They were about preserving property, reputation, and order. Everything else came later. So when we move forward into discussions of violence, punishment, restraint, and law, remember where we are standing. We are standing on a foundation that never shifted, a foundation that defined people as objects, and then asked how best to care for those objects so they continued to function. That is the beginning of this story, and it is the reason the rest of it unfolds so calmly. Violence, but with manners. When cruelty became regulated. Violence in ancient Rome did not arrive as a scandal. It arrived as a routine. It did not shock. It did not surprise. And most importantly, it did not require justification. To modern ears, this is difficult to accept. We are trained to think of violence as something that must be explained, condemned, or hidden. Rome had a different approach. In Roman society, especially within the institution of slavery, violence was assumed. It was part of the system's basic grammar, like punctuation, like breath. A slave could be beaten for mistakes, for hesitation, for silence, for speaking. Not because the act was exceptional, but because discipline was considered necessary maintenance, a reminder of hierarchy, a visible reinforcement of ownership. Violence, in this context, was not emotional. It was procedural. Roman writers rarely lingered on the brutality itself. They did not describe pain in detail because pain was not the point. Control was. Order was. The ability to correct behavior quickly and publicly mattered far more than the experience of the person receiving the correction. In a household built on ownership, punishment was not cruelty. It was instruction. And yet even Rome, with all its confidence, eventually discovered something inconvenient. Violence, when left entirely unchecked, tends to create noise, and noise creates problems. The problem was never moral outrage. Rome did not suddenly grow a conscience. The problem was instability. Excessive violence disrupted households. It frightened neighbors. It invited gossip, and gossip in Rome could grow teeth. When slaves were beaten too openly, when punishments became spectacles, they reminded everyone watching that power was fragile. That order required force, and force, once noticed, stops feeling natural. Rome preferred power that looked effortless. This is where limits begin to appear, not as prohibitions but as adjustments. Gentle suggestions wrapped in law. Violence was still permitted, expected even, but it needed to remain contained, quiet, predictable. A master was free to punish a slave, but not in ways that threatened public order, not in ways that created unrest, not in ways that made other people uncomfortable enough to talk about it loudly. The distinction matters. Rome did not ask, "Is this violence wrong?" It asked, "Is this violence inconvenient?" If punishment caused rebellion, it was discouraged. If it caused whispers, it was frowned upon. If it caused unrest, it required intervention, not because slaves were suffering, but because society was noticing. In this way, Roman law developed a strange sensitivity, not to pain, but to perception. Violence was acceptable as long as it remained private enough to preserve the illusion of calm. Think of it as violence with manners. A slave could be beaten in the household, but excessive brutality that spilled into the street drew attention, and attention was dangerous. Rome had learned this lesson the hard way. Slave revolts, though rare, were terrifying. They reminded the ruling class that their system depended on obedience, and obedience, once shaken, was difficult to restore. So the state stepped in, not to protect slaves, but to protect itself. Laws emerged that discouraged extreme cruelty, not banned it, discouraged it. A master who killed a slave impulsively might now face questions, not always punishment, but questions, and questions alone were often enough to make behavior slightly more careful. Paperwork has a way of slowing violence. This did not mean violence disappeared. Far from it, it simply became more calculated, more selective, more controlled. Punishment was still administered. Bodies were still harmed. Fear was still maintained. But it happened within boundaries that served the system rather than undermining it. The irony is difficult to ignore. Rome did not become less violent. It became better at violence, better at distributing it efficiently, better at hiding it, better at ensuring it produced obedience rather than chaos. And because these changes were framed as legal reform, they gave the appearance of progress. A society regulating cruelty can easily be mistaken for a society rejecting it. But regulation is not rejection. A whip used carefully is still a whip. The language of Roman law reflects this cold pragmatism. It does not condemn brutality. It cautions against excess. It advises moderation, not mercy. Even when emperors issued rulings suggesting that certain punishments were unacceptable, Enforcement was inconsistent. A wealthy master with influence could avoid consequences easily. A poor owner might be scrutinized more closely. Justice, as always, followed status. The real function of these laws was symbolic. They reassured the public that order was being maintained, that the state was attentive, that chaos was under control, and symbolism mattered more than outcomes. For slaves, this meant living within a narrow corridor. Violence was always possible, always nearby, but its expression depended on circumstance, on mood, on witnesses, on whether anyone important was watching. Fear became ambient rather than explosive. This kind of fear is particularly effective. It does not shock the nervous system. It wears it down, slowly, quietly, over time. A slave learned not only to obey, but to anticipate, to read a master's tone, to sense when punishment might escalate, to understand which mistakes were dangerous and which could be survived. In this way, violence trained awareness. It sharpened caution, it taught silence, and because it was legally permitted, there was no appeal, no expectation of rescue, no moral authority to appeal to. The law did not intervene to stop pain, it intervened to stop disorder. This is why Roman violence feels so unsettling when examined closely, not because it was extreme, but because it was normalized, folded into daily routine, treated as a management tool rather than a moral failure. In Rome, cruelty did not break the system. It supported it. And when it threatened to break the system, it was adjusted, smoothed, repackaged, not removed. As centuries passed, these adjustments accumulated. Each new rule promised restraint. Each reform suggested civilization. But none altered the fundamental relationship between owner and owned. Violence remained a right. It simply became a quieter one. This is the difference between chaos and control. Chaos lashes out. Control calibrates. Rome chose calibration. And calibration is what allowed the empire to endure. Because a system that regulates cruelty can survive longer than one that indulges it openly. That is the uncomfortable truth buried in Roman law. Violence was never questioned, only managed. And once cruelty becomes a managed resource, it stops feeling like cruelty at all. It becomes policy. And within this calibrated violence, something subtle happened over time. The act of punishment itself began to lose its emotional charge. It became expected, almost dull, like a door creaking in a familiar hallway. No one asked whether it should happen. They only noticed when it happened too loudly, too often, or in the wrong place. Violence was not shocking. Disruption was. A master who punished quietly was considered competent. A master who punished noisily was considered careless. The difference was never about empathy. It was about professionalism. This is where Roman society revealed one of its most uncomfortable talents. It could tolerate suffering indefinitely as long as that suffering did not interfere with the smooth rhythm of daily life. Beatings administered behind walls were acceptable. Screams carried into the street were not. Blood on a body was irrelevant. Blood on the pavement invited attention, and attention in Rome was dangerous because it reminded everyone that control required effort. The state understood this dynamic well. When it intervened, it did so not as a protector of the enslaved, but as a curator of public calm. Laws and customs began to whisper rather than shout. They did not forbid cruelty. They suggested restraint. They implied that moderation reflected well on a household, that excessive violence hinted at weakness rather than strength. In this way, even discipline became a performance. A master demonstrated authority not by how much pain he inflicted, but by how effortlessly he seemed to command obedience without needing to be seen doing so. For the enslaved, this created a peculiar emotional landscape. Violence was always possible, but rarely predictable in its intensity. The danger was not constant escalation, but constant uncertainty. A small mistake might pass unnoticed one day and provoke punishment the next. The rules were flexible enough to keep fear alive, yet stable enough to keep rebellion rare. This balance was not accidental. It was learned, refined, and maintained across generations. Over time, even the most extreme punishments became part of the background knowledge of Roman life. Everyone knew they existed. Everyone knew they could happen. And because they were legally permitted, they did not feel like crimes. They felt like consequences. Consequences, after all, carry an air of inevitability. They suggest that what happened was deserved, or at least expected. This framing allowed Roman society to distance itself emotionally from the reality of suffering while still benefiting from its effects. Violence then became a language, a quiet one, a language spoken fluently within households and understood without explanation. It communicated hierarchy, reinforced boundaries, and reminded everyone involved of their place. And like any language used daily, it stopped sounding harsh to those who spoke it often. The most unsettling part is not that Rome allowed this, but that it found ways to make it feel normal. Controlled cruelty does not announce itself as cruelty. It dresses as order. It calls itself discipline. It reassures itself that without it, everything would collapse. And once that belief takes hold, the presence of violence no longer feels like a moral problem. It feels like a practical necessity. By the time later generations looked back, the system appeared stable, even civilized. There were laws, there were limits, there were procedures. What those procedures protected, however, was never the body of the enslaved. They protected the image of Rome as a place where everything was under control, and so violence remained. Not wild, not chaotic, not questioned, simply adjusted, quieted, managed, until it became one of the most reliable tools the empire ever possessed. This is how Roman slavery sustained itself, not by constant terror, but by regulated fear, not by banning cruelty, but by teaching it when to lower its voice, not by denying violence, but by giving it rules. And when violence has rules, it rarely needs justification. It simply continues. Killing, but with paperwork. When death became an administrative issue. In the earliest days of Rome, the question of killing a slave was almost embarrassingly simple. It was not framed as a moral problem, nor even a legal one. It was a matter of ownership. A slave, being property, could be destroyed by its owner without consequence. No investigation followed. No accusation was raised. One did not commit murder by breaking one's own tool. One merely accepted a loss. This logic did not feel brutal to Roman minds. It felt consistent. If a man smashed his own table, the law did not intervene. If he killed his own slave, the law behaved the same way. The category mattered more than the act. Once a person had been successfully placed outside the circle of legal humanity, Death itself lost its drama. It became a quiet conclusion rather than a scandal. For a long time, this arrangement caused little concern. Rome was expanding, slaves were plentiful, labor flowed in from conquest, debt, and birth. Losing one enslaved body was inconvenient, but rarely catastrophic. Replacement was possible, and so killing a slave remained legally invisible, tucked safely behind the concept of private property. But Rome changed. Slowly, almost politely, it changed. The empire grew wealthier, more complex, more dependent on the labor it controlled. Slaves were no longer just abundant bodies. They were trained investments, educated accountants, skilled craftsmen, domestic managers who knew the rhythms of elite households better than their owners did. And investments, once they grow valuable, inspire regulation. The problem was not that slaves were dying. The problem was that valuable assets were being wasted. Impulsive killings disrupted productivity. They created shortages. They destabilized households. And worse, they drew attention. A dead slave still left a body. And bodies, when noticed, have a way of raising questions Rome preferred not to answer. So the law began to adjust, not loudly, not decisively, but enough to shift responsibility. Masters were no longer entirely free to kill on impulse. In theory, at least, a process emerged, an expectation of justification, a suggestion that perhaps a life, even a legally invisible one, should not be ended without reason. Reason, of course, did not mean compassion. It meant explanation, paperwork, procedure. Killing a slave began to require a narrative. Was the slave dangerous, disruptive, unmanageable? Had they committed some offense severe enough to warrant removal rather than correction? These questions did not elevate the slave to human status. They simply reframed death as an administrative decision rather than a personal one. This shift is often mistaken for moral progress. It was not. It was economic maturity. Rome had learned that systems last longer when excess is discouraged. A master who killed too freely signaled instability, poor control, bad management. And bad management in Rome was far more embarrassing than cruelty. So death moved indoors, behind forms, behind hearings that resembled justice just enough to calm observers. The state did not mourn the enslaved. It audited the circumstances. And even then, enforcement was inconsistent. Wealthy masters navigated these procedures with ease. Influence smoothed paths. Explanations were accepted. Poorer owners faced more scrutiny, not because their actions were worse, but because they lacked protection. Justice, once again, followed power. What is striking is how little this changed the lived reality of the enslaved. The possibility of death remained. It simply arrived wearing a different costume. Fear did not disappear. It adapted. Now it included uncertainty about processes as well as punishments. A slave might survive a beating but be removed quietly through official channels later. Violence had learned to wait. From the outside, Rome appeared calmer, more civilized, more restrained. Inside the system, nothing fundamental had shifted. A slave was still property. Death was still permissible. The only difference was timing and presentation. Rome did not stop killing slaves. It stopped killing them carelessly. And that distinction mattered enormously to the empire. Because carelessness creates instability. Procedure creates longevity. By transforming killing into a regulated act, Rome protected itself from its own excesses. It reduced unrest, it preserved valuable labor, and it reassured itself that everything was under control, even death. Especially death. This is the pattern we see again and again. Not abolition, but optimization. Not mercy, but management. Each reform tightened the system rather than loosening it. Each rule reinforced the original classification instead of challenging it. A slave could still die at the hands of authority, but now authority wanted a reason written down somewhere, not for the slave's sake, for Rome's, because when killing becomes paperwork, it stops feeling like violence. It feels like governance. And governance, as Rome understood better than most, is far easier to live with. And once death had been absorbed into procedure, something quietly remarkable happened. It stopped feeling final. Not to the enslaved, of course, for whom death was still death, but to the system that authorized it. When killing requires documentation, it loses its emotional weight. It becomes something that can be reviewed, categorized, explained, and filed away. Rome did not erase death. It domesticated it. A master no longer needed to act in anger. Anger was inefficient. Anger left marks. Anger created witnesses. What Rome preferred was distance. Time between decision and execution. Time to consult, to justify, to shape a narrative that framed removal as necessity rather than impulse. This delay did not save lives. It simply made the process smoother. The enslaved learned this quickly. Survival was no longer tied only to obedience, but to invisibility, to being useful enough to be worth the paperwork, to not becoming an inconvenience that required resolution. Fear adjusted itself accordingly. It became quieter, more strategic, less explosive. Hope, if it existed at all, lived in small calculations rather than dreams. And Rome found this arrangement deeply satisfying. A system in which even death could be managed without drama was a system that felt mature, civilized, advanced. The empire could look at itself and see not cruelty but control, not brutality but administration. This self-image mattered. Rome was intensely concerned with how it appeared, both to its citizens and to history itself. Laws regulating the killing of slaves allowed Rome to claim restraint without surrendering authority. It could say truthfully that it had rules, that it had limits, that it did not allow chaos. What it did not say was why those rules existed. They existed because slaves had become valuable. As the empire aged, skilled labor mattered more. Knowledge mattered more. Continuity mattered more. A dead slave represented lost training, lost investment, lost efficiency. From an economic standpoint, impulsive killing was wasteful, and Rome hated waste far more than it hated suffering. So the law stepped in not to defend life, but to protect value, to ensure that death served the system rather than disrupted it. And in doing so, Rome transformed killing from a private act into a regulated outcome, still permitted, still expected, just cleaner. This cleanliness is perhaps the most unsettling aspect. There is something profoundly disturbing about a society that can look at death and ask not whether it should happen, but how it should be processed. Rome did not ask if killing a slave was wrong. It asked whether it had been done properly. And once a society asks that question, the moral conversation is already over. The enslaved body remained legally insignificant. Its end mattered only insofar as it affected someone else's balance sheet. Paperwork did not grant dignity. It granted predictability. And predictability is the true currency of power. By the time later generations inherited these laws, the logic felt ancient, unquestionable. Killing a slave without cause seemed excessive, not because it was immoral, but because it was inefficient. Order had been internalized, procedure had replaced impulse, and violence, once again, had learned to lower its voice. This is how Rome survived itself, not by abandoning its foundations, but by reinforcing them. Each new layer of law made the system stronger, not kinder. Each restriction tightened control rather than loosening it. And each adjustment allowed Rome to continue doing what it had always done, just with better organization. So when we speak of limits, we must be careful. Limits did not mean protection, they meant refinement. They meant Rome had learned how to preserve its resources, including human ones, without destabilizing the structure that depended on them. Death remained part of the system. It simply became polite. And once death becomes polite, it no longer feels like something that needs to be stopped. It feels like something that has already been handled. Bodies without ownership. When a body did not belong to itself. In ancient Rome, the idea of bodily autonomy simply did not exist for the enslaved, not as a forgotten right, not as a denied privilege, but as a concept that never entered the legal imagination at all. To speak of violating a slave's body would have sounded strange, almost illogical to Roman ears. One does not violate what one owns. One uses it, one manages it, one adjusts it as needed. The body of a slave was not understood as a personal boundary. It was a surface, a resource, a site of labor, punishment, and consumption. Roman law did not protect it because there was nothing, legally speaking, to protect. The body did not belong inward. It belonged outward, attached entirely to the will of another. This is why acts that would horrify modern sensibilities were treated with remarkable indifference. Extreme labor was expected. Exhaustion was normal. Injury was unfortunate only if it reduced usefulness. Pain was not a legal category, it was a side effect. Sexual access followed the same logic. There was no language for consent because consent presumes ownership of the self. A slave did not possess such ownership. Intimacy, exploitation, and coercion were not differentiated in law. They collapsed into a single assumption: availability. The body existed to be used, and use was not something that required explanation. This does not mean Romans celebrated abuse. Celebration would imply awareness. What existed instead was normalization. These acts did not provoke outrage because they did not register as violations. They were understood as part of the system's background hum, no louder than footsteps in a corridor. Even when discomfort arose, it did not center on the enslaved body. It centered on property. If a slave was injured beyond usefulness, the concern was loss. If a slave was abused in a way that damaged another man's asset, the issue was compensation. The language of harm never traveled toward the enslaved. It stopped at ownership. In rare cases where disputes reached courts, the question was never whether a body had been wronged. The question was whether someone else's property had been damaged. The enslaved person remained legally silent. Their suffering existed only as evidence of depreciation. This framing shaped every aspect of daily life. A slave learned quickly that their body was not a refuge. It was not a private space. It was not even truly theirs to inhabit. Every gesture, every movement, every breath occurred within borrowed flesh, governed by someone else's needs. And because this condition was universal, it rarely drew comment. No one announced it. No one debated it. It simply was. The unsettling calm of this arrangement lies in its completeness. There was no contradiction to resolve. Roman law did not say slaves have bodies, but we will ignore their autonomy. It said nothing at all. Silence did the work. By removing bodily autonomy from the conversation entirely, Rome avoided moral tension. You cannot violate a boundary that does not exist. You cannot abuse a body that is not legally recognized as personal. You can only manage property poorly or well. And so, when regulation appeared, it again served the system, not the individual. Excessive exploitation was discouraged only when it threatened productivity. Sexual violence was ignored unless it provoked scandal. Labor was pushed to extremes until efficiency declined, not until suffering became visible. This is why Roman society could appear orderly while sustaining extraordinary harm. The law was not blind, it was focused elsewhere, on ownership, on value, on control. For the enslaved, this produced a particular kind of invisibility. Their bodies were everywhere, yet nowhere acknowledged, present, yet unrecognized as sites of experience. Pain occurred, but did not accumulate meaning. And meaning is what turns suffering into injustice. Without meaning, pain becomes noise, and noise, over time, fades. This is the final and perhaps most chilling aspect of Roman bodily control. Not that bodies were used, but that their use was unremarkable. It did not interrupt conversation. It did not require apology. It did not linger. It passed. And because it passed, without resistance, it endured. And within this quiet absence of bodily ownership, something else slowly took shape. The enslaved learned to live inside a body that was never fully theirs, a body that could be summoned, inspected, corrected, or exhausted at any moment. This produced not constant panic, but a deeper form of adaptation. Awareness replaced resistance. Sensitivity replaced protest. Survival became an exercise in reading the environment rather than asserting the self. The body in this system was not a source of identity. It was a surface on which decisions made elsewhere were written. Marks appeared and faded. Fatigue accumulated and was ignored. Pleasure, when it occurred, was incidental and rarely safe. Pain, when it arrived, was neither exceptional nor explanatory. It simply happened, and then life continued around it, as if nothing of note had occurred. Roman society found this arrangement remarkably convenient. By denying bodily autonomy at the legal level, it removed the need for constant justification. There was no debate about consent, no anxiety about boundaries, no moral accounting required. Everything operated within a single, consistent assumption. The body belonged to ownership, not to experience. Even moments that might appear intimate were stripped of intimacy by this logic. Proximity did not imply closeness. Touch did not imply recognition. The body was present, but the person was absent in the eyes of the law. And because law shapes perception, this absence extended far beyond courtrooms. It seeped into habits, expectations, and the quiet rhythm of daily life. What is most unsettling is not the severity of this control, but how little resistance it generated within the system itself. There was no contradiction to resolve, no tension to ease. Roman society did not wrestle with the ethics of bodily use. It accepted them as part of order, and order, once accepted, rarely invites reconsideration. This acceptance allowed exploitation to become routine rather than dramatic. Extreme labor was not framed as cruelty but as necessity. Sexual access was not framed as violation but as entitlement. Injury was not framed as harm but as depreciation. Each act fit neatly into the same category, use. And because use was expected, it was rarely named. In rare moments, when the law intervened, it did so with remarkable consistency, not to ask whether a body had suffered, but to determine whether ownership had been compromised. If a slave's body was damaged by someone other than the owner, the offense was theft, not violence. Compensation, not justice, was the solution. The body remained silent. Value spoke instead. This silence is perhaps the most enduring legacy of Roman slavery. Not silence imposed through fear, but silence built into the structure itself. When a system does not acknowledge bodily autonomy, it does not hear bodily complaint. Pain has nowhere to go. It dissipates. And so Roman slavery sustained itself not through constant enforcement, but through normalization. Bodies were used because bodies were available. Availability was assumed because ownership was absolute. And ownership was absolute because the law said so, calmly, repeatedly, without hesitation. This calm is what lingers. It is easy to condemn violence that shouts. It is harder to confront violence that whispers, that operates politely, that never interrupts dinner. Rome mastered that form. It turned bodies into instruments, and then taught itself not to notice the sound they made when worn down. By the time later generations inherited this system, it felt ancient, unquestionable, woven into the fabric of reality. A slave's body did not belong to them because it never had. There was no loss to mourn, no boundary to restore, only a continuation. And with that continuation, Rome moved forward confident in its order, comfortable in its control, and largely uninterested in what it cost. That is where this chapter rests. In the quiet certainty that once a body is no longer considered its own, almost anything can be done to it without the system ever feeling disturbed. Families without protection. When affection existed without rights. In ancient Rome, family was not defined by affection. It was defined by law. And for the enslaved, law was precisely what their relationships did not have. Love could exist. Attachment could grow. Familiar routines could form and repeat themselves over years. But none of it was recognized as real in the only place that mattered. The legal record remained silent. Slaves could live together. They could share meals, space, and exhaustion. They could recognize one another as partners, companions, or something quietly resembling spouses. Rome did not forbid this. It simply refused to acknowledge it. The relationship existed socially, emotionally, practically, but never legally. And without legal recognition, nothing about it was protected. This arrangement suited Rome well, allowing bonds made slaves more stable, more cooperative, less likely to flee. Affection, when permitted informally, softened hardship without threatening control. A slave with someone to return to at night was easier to manage than one with nothing to lose. Rome understood this balance intuitively. But what Rome gave, it never guaranteed. A cohabiting couple could be separated without explanation. One could be sold, reassigned, moved across the city or across the empire. There was no appeal, no legal claim, no argument to be made. The law did not see a family. It saw inventory being reorganized. Children born into these arrangements inherited the same silence. They were not recognized as sons or daughters in a legal sense. They were counted as property, new assets produced by existing ones, their value noted, their future already classified. The emotional reality of parenthood did not register. Only ownership did. This created a particular kind of tension. Family life existed in practice but not in principle. It depended entirely on permission. As long as owners allowed it, relationships continued. When permission was withdrawn, they ended. Abruptly. Completely. Without recourse. In this way, family became conditional, fragile, temporary by design. Slaves learned not to plan too far ahead, not to assume continuity, not to mistake tolerance for security. Love could exist, but only quietly, and always with the understanding that it might be interrupted. Rome did not see this as cruelty. It saw it as flexibility. The system benefited from allowing human attachment while retaining the right to dismantle it at any moment. Stability without obligation. Affection without protection. This logic extended across generations. Parents raised children knowing those children might not stay. Children grew up understanding that family bonds were real, but provisional. Emotional attachment did not guarantee proximity. Proximity did not guarantee permanence. And because this condition was universal, it rarely caused outrage. It caused adaptation. The enslaved learned to love carefully, to hold affection without claiming it, to accept separation as part of life rather than a violation of it. This emotional discipline was not enforced by law. It was learned through experience. The law, meanwhile, remained consistent. It did not interfere in family life because, legally speaking, there was none. There were living arrangements. There were productive units. There were assets, generating more assets. That was all. When disputes arose, they were framed accordingly. If a child was taken, the question was not loss, but ownership. If a partner was sold, the concern was not separation, but transaction. The emotional cost was invisible. This invisibility allowed Rome to maintain an image of order. Families existed just enough to keep life functioning, but never enough to threaten authority. Bonds were tolerated, not honored, allowed, not defended. In this way, Roman slavery mastered another quiet technique. It permitted intimacy while denying its legitimacy. It allowed love to grow but refused to recognize its consequences. And love without recognition is easier to dismantle. This chapter rests there, in that narrow space where feeling was permitted but rights were not, where families existed by grace, not guarantee, and where the absence of protection was not an oversight but a feature. What made this system particularly effective was not its brutality but its quietness. Families did not collapse in scenes of screaming and chains. They dissolved through paperwork, routine decisions, and polite transactions. A name removed from a list, a body reassigned. A child sent elsewhere because someone needed labor closer to the road, the field, or the kitchen. No dramatic moment was required. The separation itself was administrative, and because it happened so often, it became normal. In Roman society, grief did not challenge the system. It adapted to it. Enslaved parents learned to prepare their children for absence before they understood presence. They taught skills early. They taught obedience early. They taught emotional restraint, not because it was virtuous, but because it was necessary. Hope was not outlawed. It was simply impractical. Owners often describe themselves as benevolent for allowing families to exist at all. This was not irony. This was logic. From the Roman point of view, permitting slaves to live together was a kindness, not a right. And like all kindnesses granted by power, it could be withdrawn without explanation. The owner who separated a family did not see himself as cruel. He saw himself as exercising a perfectly reasonable option. Sometimes families lasted decades. Sometimes they ended within weeks. There was no pattern beyond convenience. The system did not reward loyalty with stability. It rewarded usefulness with temporary tolerance, and tolerance was mistaken over and over again for safety. There were moments when freed slaves attempted to retroactively dignify these bonds. A couple who had lived together in bondage might marry legally after manumission. Their children, once property, could be acknowledged as heirs. From a distance, this looks like redemption, but in reality it was correction after damage, recognition after irrelevance, legitimacy granted only when control had already ended. For those who never reached that point, family remained a memory rather than a structure. Something remembered, not defended. Something felt, not recorded. Rome did not fear enslaved families. It feared enslaved solidarity. Allowing small units of attachment prevented larger ones from forming. Love was permitted because it was private, it was fragile, it was easily broken, and broken bonds do not organize revolts, they organize survival. So families existed in Rome the way shadows exist at dusk, visible, familiar, always fading, never solid enough to lean on. This was not a failure of law. It was the law working exactly as intended. By allowing relationships to exist without protection, Rome ensured emotional investment without legal complication. People cared deeply but could claim nothing. They loved but owned nothing. They raised children but held no authority over their future. And this was the quiet brilliance of the system. It did not need to forbid family. It only needed to refuse to recognize it. By the time night fell in a Roman household, lamps were lit, meals prepared, and families gathered where they could. Parents whispered stories, partners shared silence, children slept where they were told. Everything looked ordinary, almost peaceful, and that was the most unsettling part. Because nothing in the scene suggested how temporary it all was. That is where chapter 5 ends. Not with separation, but with the awareness that separation was always possible, always waiting, built into the structure itself. And in Rome, what the law does not protect, it quietly prepares to remove. Names, identity, and the art of erasure. When memory became optional. In ancient Rome, a name was not a birthright, it was an assignment. And like all assignments, it could be revised, replaced, or quietly withdrawn when it no longer served its purpose. For the enslaved, identity was never something you carried with you. It was something handed to you temporarily by someone else. A slave might arrive with a name from elsewhere, a Greek name, a Thracian name, a name that once belonged to a family, a village, a language that meant something. Rome did not forbid these names. It simply did not care about them. Upon purchase, a new name was often given. Shorter, easier to shout across a courtyard, easier to remember when calling for wine, towels, or silence. Names were practical. They were tools. Sometimes the name reflected a function: cook, porter, scribe, boy, girl. Sometimes it reflected a physical trait: tall one, limping one, quiet one. Sometimes it was a joke that stopped being funny after the first 100 repetitions. None of this was accidental. A name that describes a function replaces the person behind it, and a person reduced to a function becomes easier to command. If a slave changed roles, the name could change too. Identity followed usefulness. The same body might answer to several names over a lifetime, each one erasing the last. Continuity was unnecessary. The system did not require memory. It required obedience. This constant renaming had a subtle effect. It blurred the past. When a name changes, stories attached to it fade faster. Relationships weaken. The sense of a stable self begins to loosen. Over time, a person learns not to cling too tightly to who they were yesterday, because yesterday is rarely protected. Roman households sometimes assigned the same name to multiple slaves, not because they were identical, but because it was efficient. Call one name, several people appear. Correct the wrong one later. Punish the slowest. From the owner's perspective, this was order. From the inside, it was confusion made routine. Memory became unreliable in such conditions. If you are called something long enough, you begin to respond to it, even if it is not yours, even if it replaces something you once recognized as yourself. This was not forced indoctrination, it was repetition. And repetition, when uninterrupted, does most of the work. The law supported this quiet erosion. Roman legal documents rarely recorded the enslaved by personal identity. They were listed as assets, as numbers, as skills, as property with descriptors. A slave existed in records the way furniture does, defined by location, condition, and utility. This absence of formal identity served an important purpose. It made resistance harder. A person without a recognized name leaves a weaker trace. A person without a stable identity is harder to track, harder to remember, harder to mourn publicly. Control thrives where memory is fragmented. Even freedom did not fully restore what was lost. When a slave was freed, they took the family name of their former owner. This was considered generous, a gift of belonging. But it also meant that the final identity granted by Rome was still anchored to ownership. The past remained overwritten. Rome did not see this as cruelty. It saw it as clarity. Names existed to organize society, not to express selfhood. Identity was a privilege tied to status, lineage, and recognition by law. Without those, a name was simply a label, and labels are replaceable. The result was a population trained to exist without fixed reference points. People who learned to answer quickly, adapt silently, and remember selectively. The less you remembered, the less there was to lose. And the less you claimed as your own, the safer you were. In this way, Rome mastered another quiet technique of control. It did not need to destroy identity outright. It only needed to make it unstable, flexible, temporary, something that could be adjusted as easily as schedules and supplies. At night, in the spaces between tasks, some slaves still remembered who they had been called once. They remembered names spoken by parents, by siblings, by people who no longer existed in the same world. These names survived only in thought, never in law, never in records, never in ways that could be defended. And that was enough. This chapter ends where memory thins, where identity becomes something internal, private, and unprovable. In Rome, what could not be proven did not exist, and what did not exist could not interfere with order. So names were given, changed, erased, and the system continued, smooth and quiet, powered not by forgetting alone, but by teaching people that remembering was optional. What Rome understood, perhaps better than it admitted, was that control over names was control over narrative. If you decide what someone is called, you quietly decide how they are remembered, or whether they are remembered at all. A slave without a stable name leaves no clean line through history, no consistent thread for records to follow, no solid hook for sympathy to attach itself to. And sympathy, like rebellion, needs clarity. When a person is called only by their function, their mistakes become personal defects rather than systemic consequences. The cook burns the food, the porter drops the load, the girl spills the wine. These are not people failing under pressure. These are tools malfunctioning. And tools, when they malfunction, are replaced, repaired, or discarded. No moral debate required. This language shaped perception on both sides. Owners spoke in functions because it made authority feel technical rather than violent. Commands sounded logistical, punishment sounded corrective. Even cruelty could be reframed as maintenance. The system did not say, "You are less." It said, "You are this," and this could be redefined whenever convenient. For the enslaved, the effect was quieter but deeper. When others never speak your name, you stop hearing yourself as a whole person. You begin to think in tasks, in roles, in expectations. You measure your worth by usefulness because usefulness is the only thing consistently acknowledged. Identity becomes something abstract, optional, a luxury for other people. Some resisted in small ways. They whispered old names to themselves. They taught them to children who might never use them. They remembered nicknames from before Rome, before chains, before lists. These memories survived without witnesses, without validation. They were not illegal. They were simply irrelevant. And irrelevance is a powerful silencer. Even in moments of elevation, the logic remained unchanged. A highly educated slave, a trusted administrator, a skilled physician might keep a prestigious name longer than others. But that stability was conditional. One mistake, one change of household, one shift in status, and the name could disappear as easily as it appeared. Prestige did not grant ownership of identity. It only delayed erasure. Rome's legal machinery reinforced this distance. Court cases did not require full names for slaves. Contracts did not need histories. Invoices did not care who someone had been yesterday. They cared who controlled them today. The law did not lose identities accidentally. It ignored them intentionally. This made forgetting easy. And forgetting made continuity unnecessary. By the time someone reached freedom, if they ever did, the identity they stepped into was already altered. They carried the name of their former owner. They entered society marked by association, not origin. The past did not return intact. It returned edited, sanitized, made acceptable. And still, Rome congratulated itself. It offered order, it offered clarity, it offered names that fit neatly into ledgers and public life. What it did not offer was recovery of what had been erased. This is where Chapter 6 settles, in the realization that identity was not destroyed because Rome hated individuality. It was softened because individuality complicated control. A person with a clear sense of self resists more cleanly. A person whose name changes learns to adapt instead. So Rome renamed, reassigned, simplified. And in doing so, it created a world where memory existed but only privately, where identity survived but only internally, and where the quietest form of domination was not pain but forgetting, because what is forgotten does not protest, and what has no name cannot easily be called back. Education without authority. When intelligence increased value, not freedom. In ancient Rome, intelligence was not dangerous. Autonomy was, and the system made sure never to confuse the two. A slave could be brilliant, articulate, educated beyond their owner, and still remain perfectly safe to control. Knowledge, when carefully contained, was not a threat. It was an upgrade. Rome did not fear educated slaves. It invested in them. Across the empire, enslaved people served as accountants, tutors, physicians, engineers, secretaries, librarians, and personal advisors. Some managed entire estates. Others taught the children of senators to speak elegant Greek, recite poetry, and argue philosophy with confidence. Rome relied on these minds quietly, efficiently, and without embarrassment. What Rome did not do was mistake education for equality. An educated slave did not become a person in the eyes of the law. They became a more expensive tool. Their value rose. Their status did not. A brilliant tutor was still property. A skilled doctor was still owned. Intelligence did not alter the legal category. It only refined the asset. This distinction mattered deeply because education, in this context, was never meant to liberate. It was meant to optimize. Rome educated slaves the way it sharpened blades or trained horses. The goal was better performance, not independence. The paradox was obvious, and Rome embraced it. A slave might instruct their owner in rhetoric, correct their grammar, manage their finances, and quietly understand the world better than the man giving orders. And still, the hierarchy remained intact. Knowledge flowed upward. Authority never did. This imbalance was not accidental, it was structured. Educated slaves were kept busy. Their skills were always tied to service. There was no room for intellectual wandering, no space for curiosity that did not immediately benefit the household. Learning was allowed, even encouraged, but only within approved boundaries. Education that served power was useful. Education that questioned power was irrelevant at best, dangerous at worst. So the system rewarded competence without granting control. An enslaved physician could save lives, but not decide their own. A scribe could draft contracts, but never sign one on their own behalf. A tutor could shape the mind of a future senator, but never participate in public life. Intelligence was permitted to circulate, but authority remained sealed. This arrangement produced a strange psychological landscape. Educated slaves were aware of their own capabilities. They knew what they could do, they knew how much they knew, and they knew exactly how little it mattered. This awareness did not lead to rebellion as often as one might expect. More often, it led to restraint. Because the educated understood the system too well to romanticize escape, They saw the machinery clearly, they knew the law, they knew the limits, they knew that brilliance did not dissolve ownership. It merely made ownership more profitable. In many cases, intelligence became a reason to stay alive, not to be free. Rome even admired this arrangement. Philosophers praised the efficiency of knowledgeable slaves. Writers commented on the irony without condemning it. The contradiction was noted, not challenged. A slave philosopher could discuss virtue eloquently while embodying its absence in law. This was not hypocrisy in Roman terms. It was compartmentalization. Education belonged to function, not to dignity. Even famous examples reinforced this logic. A slave might become renowned for wisdom, respected for insight, quoted long after death. But during life, their status remained unchanged until formally altered by manumission. And even then, education did not erase origin. It followed them like a footnote. The law made this clear. Education created no rights. Intelligence granted no standing. Knowledge was invisible unless attached to service. A smart slave was still a slave, just a more useful one. And usefulness was the only metric that mattered. This chapter ends in that quiet contradiction. A world where minds were cultivated but not acknowledged, where brilliance illuminated rooms it was never allowed to own, where understanding did not translate into authority, and wisdom did not guarantee dignity. Rome did not fear educated slaves because it never allowed education to become power. And in that separation, intelligence became another instrument of control. Sharp, polished, effective, and firmly held by someone else. What made educated slaves especially valuable was also what made them especially contained. The more a slave knew, the more carefully that knowledge was positioned. Rome did not leave intelligence idle. It absorbed it, directed it, and anchored it firmly to service. An educated slave was rarely left alone long enough to imagine a different future. There was always another lesson to prepare, another account to balance, another body to heal, another child to instruct. Thought was kept busy, and busy minds are quieter than angry ones. This constant usefulness created an illusion of proximity to power. Educated slaves often moved through elite spaces. They heard political conversations. They handled sensitive information. They advised quietly from the edges of rooms. To an outsider, it might appear that they were close to authority. But proximity is not possession. Being near power is not the same as holding it. And Rome never confused the two. In fact, closeness often reinforced dependence. The more indispensable a slave became, the more tightly they were held. Freedom was not automatically rewarded for excellence. Excellence was exploited. A master might promise manumission someday, vaguely, later, when the time felt right. This promise functioned less as a contract and more as motivation. Hope became another management tool, not denied, delayed. Some slaves were freed because of their intelligence. Many more were not, precisely because of it. An educated slave represented years of investment. Releasing them meant losing not only labor but expertise. And Rome did not like to waste resources. A brilliant slave was often too valuable to let go quickly. Even when manumission came, it did not erase hierarchy. Former slaves entered society marked by origin. They could work, they could earn, they could advise. But full equality remained distant. Education softened the transition, but it did not rewrite the past. Knowledge opened doors, but never the highest ones. This system produced a particular kind of silence. Educated slaves learned when to speak and when not to. They learned that insight was safest when offered as assistance, not challenge. They mastered restraint. They learned to present intelligence as loyalty, to make wisdom useful without making it threatening. Rome appreciated this discipline. It rewarded calm competence. It trusted educated slaves with tasks, not with agency. The mind was welcomed, the voice was regulated, and that is where Chapter 7 settles. In the realization that education, stripped of authority, becomes another form of labor. Mental effort replaces physical strain, but ownership remains unchanged. Intelligence sharpens the tool, but does not free the hand holding it. Rome did not fear smart slaves because it never allowed intelligence to become independence. Knowledge was permitted, understanding was tolerated, wisdom was admired, but equality was never on the syllabus. And so, in a world where minds could soar while bodies remained owned, education became not a ladder out, but a deeper role within. That is how Rome taught without liberating, invested without empowering, and benefited from brilliance without ever standing beside it. Justice without a voice. When petition replaced protection. In ancient Rome, justice was not something you possessed. It was something you were permitted to approach, briefly, cautiously, and usually without expectation. For the enslaved, the legal world existed like a distant building seen from across a courtyard. Impressive, solid, entirely out of reach. A slave could not easily sue their owner. In most cases, they could not sue at all. The obstacle was not a lack of evidence or procedure. It was status. Roman law did not treat enslaved people as legal persons with standing. They were objects within the system, and objects do not bring cases. They are discussed, they are assessed, they are transferred, they are never plaintiffs. This did not mean the law was silent about abuse. It meant the law spoke from a different angle. When violence occurred, the question was rarely whether harm had been done to a person. The question was whether order had been disturbed, whether property had been damaged, whether public calm had been threatened. Justice in this sense was managerial. There were exceptions carefully designed to appear humane while remaining controllable. In extreme cases, a slave could attempt to petition the state. This was not a lawsuit. It was an appeal, a plea, a last resort performed in public, often by throwing oneself at a magistrate's feet or seeking refuge near imperial statues. The gesture mattered as much as the claim. It signaled desperation severe enough to be noticed. But even here, the goal was not to right a wrong. It was to prevent disorder. Authorities intervened when cruelty risked scandal, unrest, or the appearance of lawlessness. Excessive abuse embarrassed the system. It made Rome look uncontrolled, and Rome valued its image. If a master's behavior threatened public stability, the state might step in, not to defend the slave's dignity, but to reassert control. The remedy often involved transferring ownership rather than punishing cruelty. The problem was not that someone had suffered. The problem was that suffering had become visible. This distinction shaped every legal encounter. A slave seeking relief had to demonstrate not pain but danger, not injustice but disruption. Only when abuse hinted at rebellion, riot, or moral outrage did the law become interested. Justice arrived not as protection, but as containment. Even testimony followed this logic. Slaves could speak in court, but only under specific conditions, often involving coercion. Their words were not trusted freely. They were extracted. Truth, in Roman courts, was something pain could supposedly reveal. Silence was assumed. Speech was forced. And even then, the testimony served the case of free citizens, not the rights of the enslaved. This made legal action psychologically exhausting as well as risky. To accuse one's owner was to gamble everything. Failure meant retaliation. Success often meant reassignment rather than freedom. Either way, the slave remained within the system. The law did not offer exit. It offered adjustment. Rome defended this structure as rational. The state did not exist to referee private households unless those households threatened public order. Domestic cruelty was unfortunate but not inherently illegal. The law's loyalty was to stability. Everything else was secondary. Over time, this created a population that understood the limits intimately. Slaves learned that the law was not deaf, but uninterested, that justice was not absent, but selective, that appeals worked best when framed as problems for Rome, not for themselves, and so legal awareness became another quiet discipline. People learned when not to speak, when silence was safer, when endurance was more practical than appeal. The law did not crush hope directly. It simply made hope inefficient. This chapter ends in that restrained space, where justice exists but only as a tool of order, where law intervenes but never fully on behalf of those without status, and where the possibility of appeal serves more as pressure release than protection. Rome did not deny the enslaved access to law entirely. It offered just enough to maintain control, enough to look civilized, enough to keep the system running smoothly. Because in Rome, justice was not about fairness, it was about balance. And balance was achieved not by hearing every voice, but by ensuring that most of them remained quiet. What made this legal structure especially effective was that it never pretended to be fair. It pretended to be functional. Roman law did not promise justice to everyone. It promised order to society. And from Rome's point of view, that promise was largely kept. The rare moments when the state intervened were remembered precisely because they were rare. Stories circulated of emperors who punished exceptionally cruel masters, of officials who removed abused slaves from dangerous households. These stories were repeated not because they were typical, but because they were exceptional. They reassured the public that the system had limits, even if those limits were faint and inconsistently enforced. For the enslaved, these examples created a delicate illusion. The law was not closed. It was simply very far away. It might listen someday if circumstances aligned perfectly. This possibility encouraged patience more than resistance. Endurance became rational. Waiting became strategy. The process itself discouraged frequent appeals. Petitioning required access, courage, timing, and witnesses. It required stepping into visibility. And visibility for someone owned was dangerous. A failed appeal did not disappear into paperwork. It followed the petitioner back home. The law did not protect those who tested it unsuccessfully. So most injustice remained unreported, not because it was tolerated, but because it was expected. Slaves learned that legality and morality were not the same language. That harm could be real without being actionable. That suffering alone did not create a case. This understanding shaped behavior subtly. The enslaved learned to calibrate their pain, to recognize which injuries mattered to the state and which did not. Excessive cruelty that shocked free observers might trigger intervention. Daily brutality would not. The system trained people to endure silently and to reserve appeal for moments of absolute extremity. Rome called this balance. Too much cruelty risked instability. Too much intervention risked undermining authority. The law walked carefully between the two. It did not eliminate abuse. It managed its visibility. Even when a slave was removed from an abusive household, the outcome rarely resembled justice. The slave might be sold, transferred, reassigned. The problem was relocated, not resolved. The law corrected disruption, not suffering. And this was the key. Roman legal mechanisms were not designed to heal. They were designed to maintain flow. Labor must continue. Order must remain. Public confidence must be preserved. Individual well-being was incidental. This meant that justice, as a concept, existed only in fragments. Enough to be referenced, enough to be believed in abstractly, never enough to rely on consistently. The system survived because it offered hope without guaranteeing relief. By the time night settled over Rome, courts closed, petitions ceased, and households resumed their routines. The law withdrew back into marble buildings and official language. Inside private spaces, power continued as it always had, quiet, intimate, largely unchallenged. And that is where Chapter 8 ends, in the understanding that legality was never meant to save the enslaved. It was meant to save the system from itself, to prevent excess from becoming chaos, to keep domination orderly. Rome did not silence slaves by forbidding speech. It silenced them by making speech ineffective. Because a voice that is rarely heard learns eventually to lower itself. Freedom with conditions. When hope was allowed but never guaranteed. In ancient Rome, freedom was not something a slave could claim. It was something they were allowed to imagine. And that difference mattered more than it first appears. Manumission, the formal act of release from slavery, was the only recognized exit from the system. There were no shortcuts, no legal rights to demand it, no automatic reward for suffering. Freedom existed as a possibility, carefully framed, selectively granted, and always controlled. Rome presented manumission as generosity, as proof that the system was flexible, humane even. A slave could be freed for loyal service, for exceptional skill, for long obedience, or simply because an owner felt inclined. The reasons varied. The power never did. Manumission was not justice. It was discretion. This framing was intentional. By making freedom a privilege rather than a right, Rome transformed hope into a management strategy. A slave who believed freedom was possible tomorrow was less likely to resist today. Endurance became investment. Obedience became negotiation. The future was always just far enough away to remain useful. The promise did not need to be explicit. Often it was vague, someday, later, when the time is right. These words carried enormous weight. They required no contract, no timeline, no obligation. Hope functioned best when undefined. And Rome understood this psychology deeply. A system that forbids hope invites rebellion. A system that permits hope channels behavior. Manumission created a hierarchy of patience. Some slaves worked harder, some behaved more carefully, some avoided conflict at all costs, believing that visibility endangered their chances. Hope did not weaken control. It refined it. Even the act of freeing a slave reinforced the system's logic. The ceremony was formal, public, legal. It emphasized that freedom came from authority, not resistance. The newly freed individual emerged not as someone who had escaped oppression, but as someone who had been granted release. Gratitude was expected. Loyalty often continued. Freedom itself arrived with conditions. A freed slave did not become equal to freeborn citizens. They carried legal and social limitations. They owed obligations to their former owner, now reclassified as a patron. They were expected to provide services, loyalty, and respect. The relationship changed shape. It did not disappear. Names revealed this continuity. Freed individuals took the family name of their former master. Their identity and freedom remained anchored to ownership. This was presented as inclusion. In reality, it was traceability. The past followed them into public life, quietly, permanently. Social memory worked the same way. A freed person could work, earn, marry, even prosper. But origin lingered. It shaped expectations. It limited ambition. Certain offices remained closed. Certain honors remained unreachable. Freedom opened doors, but not all of them. And still, manumission mattered. It mattered because it was real. It mattered because it happened often enough to be believable. It mattered because it gave the enslaved something to aim toward that did not involve breaking the system. Rome did not promise freedom to everyone. It promised that freedom existed. This promise was enough. The brilliance of the system was not in its cruelty, but in its patience. It allowed time to do the work, years of service, decades of restraint, lifetimes spent waiting for a moment that might never arrive. Hope stretched time, and stretched time kept people in place. Even those who were never freed lived under the influence of the possibility. The system did not need to deliver hope universally. It only needed to keep it alive collectively. A few successes sustained the belief of many. This chapter ends with that realization that freedom in Rome was not the opposite of slavery. It was part of it, integrated, regulated, used. Manumission did not dismantle the system, it stabilized it. It gave slavery a horizon, a story that could be told, a future that could be imagined without changing the present. Rome did not trap people by closing every door. It trapped them by leaving one door slightly open, guarded, conditional, and always owned by someone else. And in that narrow doorway, generations learned to wait. What made manumission so effective was not how often it happened, but how carefully it was framed. Rome never allowed freedom to feel inevitable. It was always contingent, always earned, always revocable in memory, even when irreversible in law. A freed person did not step into a clean future. They carried a past that remained legible to everyone around them. This lingering trace served a purpose. It reminded the enslaved that freedom was exceptional, not normal. It reminded the freeborn that hierarchy still mattered. And it reminded the freed themselves to remain cautious. Gratitude was safer than confidence. Modesty was wiser than ambition. The system encouraged this emotional posture subtly, without force. Freedom, when it came, often arrived late, after youth, after strength had been spent, after decades of service. For many, manumission did not open a long new chapter, it closed an old one. The years of waiting had already shaped who they were. Habits of obedience did not disappear with legal status. They lingered quietly in posture, speech, expectation. Rome relied on this continuity. It did not want former slaves to become unpredictable. It wanted them useful, loyal, and stable. The patron-client relationship ensured this. Freed people remained tied into networks of obligation. They were free, but not unanchored. The rope was loosened, not cut. For those who were never freed, the presence of freed people was still influential. It kept the idea alive. It proved that obedience might be rewarded. It discouraged collective resistance by promoting individual aspiration. Each person waited for their own turn. Each waited alone. This isolation was crucial. Hope, when individualized, does not organize. It competes. It turns shared suffering into private calculation. Who is closer to freedom? Who has a better chance? Who should stay quiet a little longer? Rome did not need to crush solidarity. It dissolved it through expectation. Even rebellion did not erase this logic. When revolts failed, the promise of manumission regained strength. Order returned not only through punishment, but through reassurance. The system endured because it offered an alternative to despair that did not threaten its structure. The end of a slave's life, freedom might arrive, or it might not. But the hope of it had already done its work. It had shaped behavior, restrained anger, and extended control across years that force alone could not have managed. This is where Chapter 9 truly ends, with the understanding that freedom was not outside the system of slavery. It was inside it, carefully positioned, carefully rationed, carefully used. Rome did not build its power solely on chains. It built it on anticipation, on the quiet belief that tomorrow might be different if today was endured correctly. And that belief kept the system alive far longer than cruelty ever could. The quiet efficiency of control. When power learned to regulate itself. If there is one misunderstanding that lingers around Roman slavery, it is the belief that Rome slowly became more humane. That limits appeared because conscience awakened. That restraint emerged because empathy finally arrived. History, unfortunately, is rarely that comforting. Rome did not humanize slavery. Rome bureaucratized it. The system did not soften. It stabilized. What looks like mercy from a distance reveals itself as management when examined closely. Laws appeared not to protect the enslaved, but to protect continuity, to prevent excess from becoming chaos, to ensure that violence remained productive, not disruptive. That ownership stayed profitable, not scandalous. That power endured without drawing attention to its sharpest edges. Every limit had a function. Every boundary served efficiency. Slaves were not spared because they were valued as people. They were preserved because they were valuable as labor. Families were allowed to exist because they reduced unrest. Education was encouraged because it increased output. Legal intervention appeared only when cruelty risked public disorder. Even freedom itself was permitted selectively, not as justice, but as incentive. This was not moral progress. It was administrative refinement. Rome understood something fundamental about domination. Unregulated power destroys itself. Too much cruelty invites rebellion. Too much chaos weakens authority. Too much visibility invites criticism. So power learned to slow down, to document, to formalize, to appear reasonable. The question, what were masters not allowed to do, sounds humane. It feels ethical. It suggests limits born of care. But in Rome, that question exposes something colder. Those limits existed not to save the enslaved from suffering, but to save the system from collapse. They were guardrails, not lifelines. They kept domination smooth, predictable, and socially acceptable. They made oppression sustainable. And this is the quiet lesson history leaves us. When power begins to regulate itself, it is not always because it has grown kinder. Sometimes it is because it has grown smarter. Sometimes rules are not reminders of morality, but tools of longevity. Rome did not ask how to end slavery. It asked how to make it last. And for centuries, the answer worked. That is where this story truly ends. Not with chains, but with procedures. Not with screams, but with paperwork. Not with chaos, but with order. Because the most enduring forms of power are not the loudest. They are the ones that learn how to limit themselves just enough to survive. And once power becomes efficient, it rarely needs to be cruel all the time. A final reflection before the lights go out. By the time we reach the end of this story, nothing about it feels sudden anymore. There is no dramatic twist waiting at the door, no moment where Rome suddenly reveals itself as secretly compassionate or unexpectedly monstrous. What remains is something far more unsettling in its calm consistency. Rome did not soften slavery. It organized it. What survived for centuries did not do so because it was fueled by constant brutality, but because it learned restraint. Limits were introduced not to heal wounds, but to prevent infection. Not to end suffering, but to keep it from spreading in ways that threaten stability. The system did not evolve toward morality. It evolved toward efficiency. Every rule we encountered served the same quiet purpose. Violence was managed, not abolished. Families were permitted, not protected. Education was encouraged, not emancipating. Justice was available, but distant. Freedom existed, but only as an exception. Each boundary made the system smoother, more predictable, easier to maintain, and that is the part history rarely announces out loud. When power begins to regulate itself, it is tempting to call it progress. But regulation does not always mean restraint for the sake of others. Sometimes it is simply power learning how to endure without exhausting itself. Rome understood that domination cannot survive on fear alone. Fear burns too fast, so it added patience, incentives, paperwork, procedure, hope, carefully measured and unevenly distributed. And with that, it built something far more durable than raw force. The most unsettling lesson is not what Rome allowed or forbade. It is how reasonable everything began to look once it was systematized. How suffering, when organized, becomes background noise, how injustice, when legalized, feels less urgent, how cruelty, when efficient, no longer needs to shout, and that lesson does not belong only to the past. History does not warn us with monsters alone. Sometimes it warns us with systems that work very well. As we let this story settle, there is no need for outrage, no need for urgency. This is late night history. It does not ask you to act. It asks you to notice, to recognize how easily power can dress itself in order and how quietly that order can become permanent. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for choosing to sit with history instead of rushing past it. If your eyes are heavy now, that's all right. If your thoughts are drifting, that's expected. Let the story fade where it is. This has been a quiet journey through power, law, and the careful machinery of control. We'll leave Rome here, still standing, still orderly, still confident that it did nothing wrong. Good night. Sleep well, and when history whispers again, you'll know how to listen.